Welcome, everyone. So delighted that you're here. I am Lynn McDonald, and I am a river guide for the next few sessions. And I just love that terminology. I just think it's a beautiful and charming description of what we're trying to do here is the rivers of learning. So I'm very thrilled to be part of this event in this way. Let's begin by recognizing many of us live and work on the traditional lands and waters of Indigenous peoples. We are grateful for their stewardship and the participation of many Indigenous practitioners, facilitators, and presenters in systemic design. This lineup in the program, which is hosted by the Flourishing Enterprise Institute, is a very interesting because here we will explore the practical applications of emerging systemic management innovations. So sometimes you'll hear use of the term SMIs, and those are systemic management innovations. And FEI's Randy Saad will introduce the Institute and its dimensions. He'll highlight its mission, applied research focus, and its community of practice, of which I am a member. And Director of Learning and Innovation, Tim Posselt, will explore what they've learned about how enterprises need to adapt and how the emerging field of systemic management innovations can help. And Bernd Herbert will speak to transformation and the complexity involved in a program being incubated by the FEI. Randy will share a case study example. So it's going to be very practical and meaty, and we go from one presenter to another. And so I will introduce each one all at once now. So Randy has been the executive director of the Flourishing Enterprise Institute since co-founding the organization in 2019. He's worked with multinational and boutique firms, including his own private practice, for more than 15 years. And he advises a wide range of private, institutional, and not-for-profit clients. He is executive director of Refocus, a nonprofit cooperative focused on enabling senior leaders to respond more effectively to accelerating change. And through that organization, that effort, Randy has co-developed and facilitates the Enterprise Evolution Program, which you will hear about. And I'm involved there. It's very interesting. Randy is a speaker, facilitator, and lecturer. He's a fellow of the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo and the Weizmann Center for Engagement and Research and Sustainability at Wilfrid Laurier University. So we're very happy to have Randy here and providing his insight. Dr. Tim Posselt is the Director of Learning and Innovation. Tim holds a PhD in business management. He gained extensive experience working in research consulting environment in Germany, where he managed a team of researchers focused on business transformation. Throughout his professional life, Tim has been applying systems thinking to facilitate organizational transformation in various settings. As co-owner of a manufacturing business, he intimately understands the challenge of bringing transformative change into a web of existing values, beliefs, and organizational structures. Bernd Herbert specializes in business design, innovation, sustainability, and systemic design with expertise in business modeling, circular business models, strategic foresight, and systems thinking. He's a certified management consultant and project manager. He provides consulting, advisory services, and workshops focused on strategy development, facilitation, and project management. He's certified for the Flourishing Business Canvas method, lectures on systemic design for strategy and future fit organizations in Lisbon. He's the course lead for business model discovery and systemic design for strategic strategy and future fit organizations at the School of the Possible. He leads the Systems Innovation Hub in Lisbon, is a core member of Catalyst 2030 Spain and Portugal. He holds a Master of Business Management and a Master of Economy and Linguistics. He's a fellow of the RSA. Again, a sampling in each of these cases of their very deep experience in history. Thank you, Bernd, for doing this today. Randy, Tim, we're so pleased to have you lead us through learning more about the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. So over to you, Randy.
And a big thank you, Lynn, for that wonderful intro, for setting us up for this session, which we're all very excited about. I wanted to first just thank our friends at the RSA for organizing this event and giving us the opportunity to collaborate. It was a pretty cool idea to develop something more of a mini symposium rather than a bunch of individual sessions that really bring light to the sort of systems change work we're doing at the FEI. It's nice to see some familiar faces in the list of participants here, but also a lot of people who I don't think we typically see in our network sessions and so forth. So if you are new to the FEI, learning a little bit today, a really warm welcome on behalf of our team to all of you. It's exciting to have some new friends to meet, and hopefully the presentation and some of the details we cover don't disappoint. We'll try and make this as interactive as possible with a couple of different opportunities for pause and questions and discussion. So please, if you do have questions along the way, feel free to pop them into the chat. And if Lynn thinks it's a good idea, she might just interrupt one of us and have that question come up right away so we can address it. Otherwise, we'll leave it for one of those points in time later on. In any case, I'm going to get started. So I'll share my screen. And yeah, we can dive right in. Everybody see that okay? Excellent. Okay. So in terms of our agenda, as Lynn mentioned, we'll start with a brief intro that I'll walk us through. We'll have Tim talk about the transition towards systemic management. Bernd will talk about transformative change. I'll share an example related to the city of Kitchener in Canada, and then we'll offer a little invitation and conclude our session. So just a little bit of background on the Flourishing Enterprise Institute. For those of you who are unfamiliar, we're an applied research and innovation institute. And I'd say we're dedicated to enabling this transition to organizations that perform exceptionally well, while also enhancing the well-being of communities and wider ecosystems they operate within. And I want to be practical about that. I mean, we understand the nature of the world and the systems we're nested in are highly unsustainable, and it isn't really possible to have an organization that's sustainable inside or that flourishes inside of a set of nested systems that aren't themselves flourishing. But the idea is we're trying to develop the pathways. We see organizations or enterprises as a critical leverage point for enabling system-wide change. And our interest is to think of organizations as a force for positive change and a lever for enabling change across systems. So we tend to be pragmatic and realistic about what we mean by flourishing organizations and what we think we can enable. But I also challenge you to kind of hold us to that promise and call us out if you feel like there is anything rather unrealistic or ungrounded in what we share. Historically speaking, we were originally founded at OCAD University in Toronto, and we're co-hosted now between the Viessmann Center for Engagement and Research in Sustainability at Wilfrid Laurier University and OCAD. And at the moment, we're operating on funding granted by the Social Sciences and Communities Research Council of Canada and the Posselt School of International Affairs. In terms of our history, we started back in 2012 as an organization, a very informal and voluntary-driven organization called the Strongly Sustainable Business Model Group. Since that point of inception, we've hosted over 100 monthly meetings that were designed to facilitate dialogue and collaboration between a diversity of innovators, practitioners, and academics alike. And our focus has naturally evolved from one that initially started around business modeling innovation and what it looks like to design a business model for flourishing, to really thinking about the full spectrum of innovations that we need to apply and integrate in order to transform organizational management across the board. Most recently, we partnered with Veris that I mentioned earlier in 2019 to secure some funding and enable us to transition from this strongly sustainable business model group that was rather informally run into the FEI, which as it stands right now, I describe as a developing applied research institute. So what do we actually do as an organization? There's a few things. Firstly, we study the application of systemically designed management innovations in the field. So this to say, when those within our network are applying advanced innovations that enable the possibility of flourishing with organizations, we try to bring applied research to that process. And the reason why we think that's critically important is because, one, if we're going to disrupt mainstream management, we need to build a body of evidence that demonstrates the efficacy of these systemically oriented innovations. And as well, as part of refining and advancing and making those innovations truly fit for purpose, we need to gain insight and learn from experience in order to further their development. And we believe that this applied research accelerates that process of learning and advancing innovation. From the studying of innovations, we then document, publish, and aim to widely mobilize the new knowledge that we create. And we also convene and facilitate dialogue with and grow our community of practice. So what was once this sort of loosely stitched together group is now becoming a more formal and regular entity that is, what do I say, engaging participants in a variety of different ways that we'll talk about shortly. So the group itself, we have titled CAFE, spelt out, that is the Community for Flourishing Enterprise, which is free for anyone to join. We typically host monthly sessions and have regular communications through a newsletter to share updates on opportunities for collaboration and the project work that we're doing. We typically also collaborate with like-minded and similarly focused partners, funders, and community members as we develop innovative projects. So as I mentioned, often we work directly with innovators who are testing their innovations in the field, and we aim to build partnerships around these innovations that help to create more opportunities for testing and helping to mobilize them in practice. And again, just a quick mention here of the core members of the FEI team. Lynn and Bernd are both part of our network of collaborators and partners. But in terms of the day-to-day functioning or operations of our FEI organization, I serve as the executive director. Dr. Peter Jones, in case you were at the session just before this one, where Peter spoke with John Ehrenfeld about the concept and origins of flourishing as a term and concept. He is our academic director. Of course, Tim is our director of innovation and learning. And Morgan, who you'll see in this session, and hopefully maybe possibly touching with you in the chat in case you have questions and such. Morgan is responsible for our community development. So she manages a lot of our engagement, our social media, and communications. And on that note, I will pause and pass over to Tim to talk us through the transition towards systemic management. Tim.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, welcome everyone also from my side. Maybe just as I begin, hope you don't mind my halo in the background here. I just had to relocate a little bit because I had some internet issues, but that seems to have fixed it. So that's great. I'm also dealing with a virus right now, so if I'm not as quick on my feet as I might be otherwise, please excuse that, and feel free to at any point just raise your hand or speak up if something didn't make sense at all, or if you have a question, something needs to be clarified. Yeah, so we'll talk about systemic management, and if you joined the last session and now heard Randy's introduction, then you know the Flourishing Enterprise Institute is concerned with flourishing, with stewarding organizations towards flourishing and enabling their communities and ecosystems to flourish. So one critical aspect of that, at least in our perception, is to introduce systemic management into organizations at the center of the organization. And another crucial aspect of that would be systemic management innovations, which I'll also talk about a little bit. It's important to mention before I kind of dive into it that this is an emergent field, and the process of kind of understanding what systemic management means, what systemic management innovations are, is also an emergent process for us. So in that sense, please don't take what we're presenting now as some sort of a finished product, but it's really in a process of becoming, and we're very much welcoming different perspectives, additions, criticisms, etc. That's just where we're at with this right now. And yes, Randy, thanks. If we can go to the next slide, I just wanted to briefly frame again why we think systemic management is so important and the goal of flourishing. I probably don't have to introduce the polycrisis to most of you here. I think what I want to point out is an aspect of the polycrisis that's often, maybe not highlighted enough. And that is that we're dealing with a myriad of different crises at the same time. And these can be environmental crises like climate change and biodiversity loss. They can be social crises like involuntary migration, generally social disruption. They can be economic crises. So there's a myriad of different crises going on. And what's important is to understand that these aren't isolated. So we're not dealing with isolated challenges, but these challenges are highly interconnected. They're influencing each other in feedback loops. And so what that creates is an environment of complexity, high complexity of the different challenges that organizations are facing. And in that sense, we believe that conventional management approaches, conventional management methods are simply incapable of dealing with these crises in an adequate way. So that's the situation that organizations find themselves in, and that we're hoping to address with our work at the Flourishing Enterprise Institute and with systemic management. So on the next slide, thanks, Randy. Perfect. I'm showing here the iceberg model on the left side, and there's been a lot of criticism of the iceberg model lately, and I kind of agree with a lot of that criticism, but I think for the purposes of this presentation, it's still a valid way of showing our theory of change and where we think we need to address this challenge. So essentially at the FEI, what we're trying to do is we're trying to primarily address the lowest levels of the iceberg. We could even go a little bit deeper here than the mental model level of the iceberg and maybe talk about worldviews and the need to shift worldviews. I think that's also something that was just addressed in the fireside chat if you've attended that. But essentially the iceberg model, if you haven't seen it before, it talks about different layers of systems. And the deeper you go down the iceberg, the higher the leverage in terms of systems change that you can effect by addressing that layer. So we talk about simple events at the top level, talk about patterns of behavior one layer down, and we go into the deeper system structures and finally down to the mental models. And there have been some extensions now that go down into certain worldviews of the actors in the system. So for us at the FEI, what we really need to address in order to enable organizations to deal with that complexity I just laid out is to address the worldviews and the mental models of leaders, and especially in a way that helps them understand that their organization isn't an isolated entity, but that it's deeply interconnected with other actors, with other systems, and especially also nested within higher level systems. And so the question then becomes, what happens when I view my organization as such a living system that's part of other living systems? And so that takes us to the second lowest level here of the iceberg, to the system structures and especially the strategic management practices, which we believe need to change profoundly. And so we want to now dive into these two bottom layers of the iceberg in the next couple of slides to understand what it means to understand your organization as a living system that's part of other living systems, and then to look at how strategic management practices change in line with that. So taking a quick look at organizations as, and it says service ecosystems here, the reason for that is at the bottom you see a source. That's a paper we published in 2022, where we take the service ecosystems perspective as a specific theoretical systems perspective to kind of carve out what it means to look at an organization as such a system. So looking at organizations as systems that are part of other living systems, there are especially three characteristics that we thought were important to point out that make us kind of rethink and remodel how we understand organizations. The first one I already spoke to a little bit is that organizations are essentially collections of interconnected actors that are highly interdependent, both within the organization, but also outside of the organization. So I don't view my organization anymore as some sort of isolated entity where I can then also formulate isolated profit-oriented goals that don't take anyone else into account necessarily and just focus on financial growth for my organization. And they're also nested within other broader systems, such as social systems, planetary systems, etc. And we recognize interdependencies between the health of these systems and the health of the organization. And so once we really thought that through, we understand that sustainability goals aren't outside of the organization or side goals to consider. They are very much at the center of the organization. Sustainability goals become organizational goals. The second aspect that's important to consider is emergence, also something we just heard about in the fireside chat. Essentially, what we're saying here is that the properties of organizations as a system and also of the wider system, so the health of the organization, success of the organization, the health of wider ecosystems, are emergent properties. So we cannot predict those from just looking at the elements of an organization, because there are so many interconnected elements of the systems that interact in feedback loops that it's impossible to predict. So that has profound implications for the management of an organization as well. And the third aspect here is socially governed. That's why we thought it was especially valuable to apply the service ecosystems perspective, because it's pretty unique to that perspective, is that it introduces that organizations as living systems are social systems as well, and social systems are shaped by social institutions. So social institutions are norms, rules, laws, beliefs. They can be assumptions, they can be schemas of how I see the world, and mental models. And these are often overlooked when we look at systems in general, at organizations, but they heavily shape how our actors within organizations between each other, interact with each other. So they orchestrate social systems. And depending on how these institutional arrangements are arranged, that either can enable or it can constrain transformative change within systems. So we really need to look at these institutions and institutional arrangements to understand how to perhaps shape the organization differently. Now, if we take these three aspects of the organization as a living system, that it's interconnected and nested, it's emergent, and it's socially governed, and we try to apply that to management thinking and management practice, then we can perceive certain shifts that are necessary from conventional management to systemic management. And we've summarized and provided a couple of examples for these shifts here on the slide. Again, work in process. This is work in progress. This is not a final product. So there's much more to consider here, but these are the ones that we feel like are important to highlight at this moment. So firstly, conventional management practices are often very internally focused and compartmentalized. I spoke to this a little bit already, but organizations essentially define themselves as a more or less isolated entity. So they define their own goals and pursue them with relatively little consideration to external stakeholders. And certainly that consideration is only in terms of how it relates to the organization's own goals. And then they address these complex interconnected issues that I talked about separately. So sustainability might be brought in as an issue, but it's again in a siloed, compartmentalized area of the organization, and isn't necessarily integrated with the marketing of the products of the organization, for example. Now, if we apply systems thinking to this, and we think of how systemic management practices would look compared to these internally focused and compartmentalized practices, Randy, if we can click on, thank you, they would be integrative. So we would consider the organization as part of these wider systems. So we also consider how the organization depends on these wider systems and how it impacts these wider systems, which can include co-benefits of different actions of the organization, unintended consequences. And that means recognizing the interconnections of the challenges and opportunities the organization faces. So instead of internally focused and compartmentalized, the organization would become more integrative in the way it views itself. Secondly, organizations often, and this goes more into the how the organization is run, often are very controlling and insular. So an organization, think for example of a city government, although its mandate is to really evolve the well-being of its community, still wants to hold a lot of control and power over how that is done. And then it also pursues different goals within siloed departments. So that compartmentalized view is then put into practice in compartmentalized departments. So we have a very centralized power structure and relatively independent departments. And on the other hand, with systemic management practices, we believe that management would become more collective. So that means really pursuing the objectives within flexible teams, transdisciplinary teams, where people from different departments and outside stakeholders come together to work on an issue. These teams can be more fluid, and through that to foster truly healthy, equitable, and cooperative relationships. So that's within the organization again, but also to stakeholders outside of the organization. And very importantly, not just to those stakeholders that matter for the profit or financial well-being of the organization, but to the health of the systems the organization is nested within. So essentially that includes all stakeholders and the effort of making meaningful and cooperative relationships with these stakeholders. Thirdly, conventional management practices are often linear and reactive. So organizations will respond to challenges after impacts are observed, and the goals they make are relatively short-term oriented and reliant on historical data. So that kind of reflects a worldview that is relatively mechanistic, where we can understand, from the way the machine, let's say, has worked previously, we can extrapolate how we can predict it to work in the future. So we can make relatively stable, steady plans for the next couple of years with different goals set along the way, and we can hold on to these goals and essentially plan the future like that. Now, a complex living system doesn't work like that. So instead of being linear and reactive, an organization that's more systemically managed would be more adaptive. So here we aim to anticipate and aim to identify root causes of complex challenges. We design processes and structures to be responsive to change and to embrace experimentation and failure. So I think this adaptive dimension is something that we've perhaps most seen in businesses nowadays, where we talk about adaptive ways of managing a business, agile, lean ways of managing a business. But still, as we can see here, that is only one aspect that needs to be addressed if we really want to transform management of an organization towards more systemic management.
Tim, may I ask?
Yes.
Can I ask a question? I'm riffing off what Sebastian put in the chat.
Oh, I didn't see that. Yeah, that's great.
Can you reflect on sort of the connection of this to actually organizational survival? So, and Sebastian, if you wanted to frame the question in your own way, please speak up. But yeah, just the connection to organizational survival.
So would it be fair to say that the question is, how does this impact the probability of organizational survival, the resilience or viability of the organization?
Yes, I think so.
Absolutely.
That's great. That's a great question. And I think that's one of the core questions here. Can maybe just share from our work with the FEI and our work in trying to bring systemic management to organizations, that what we're fighting very often is that we're dealing with these two different worldviews or perceptions of organizations that I've just outlined. And so if I come from a classical management perspective, that's profit-oriented, short-term oriented, the question is, why should I do this? Why should I take this more integrative perspective of my organization, where of course I still have to be financially viable, but I suddenly take a lot of different other goals into account and make them my own? What's the point? What's the benefit for me? So I think that question really touches that core. And my answer would be twofold. I think there are ways of framing it within that old mindset that also make sense, where we can see that adapting a more sustainable way of operating a business increasingly, as the world changes, as customer perceptions change, but also as legal requirements change, and as perhaps, for example, extreme weather events and the risks associated with that become more frequent. I think there's an increasing way of framing a way of managing a business like this, where it makes sense simply from a short-term profit-oriented view. I don't like to frame it that way because that's not how we see the world. So from a different perspective, it becomes very naturally, I think, apparent that we are, and every organization is dependent on the health and well-being of the systems around it. So social systems, think about the social unrest that we're experiencing all over the world right now, and how that impacts the political climate, and how that again then impacts businesses, and not least, of course, the climate change, the environmental changes that we see. And so I think that understanding in terms of organizational survival is very, very clear. If I, and therefore, all organizations, if we apply a perspective that ignores that, then we're seeing what we're seeing in the world right now. We're acting in a way that destroys or unsettles these systems, and therefore we're kind of chipping away at our own viability. So that's the connection to just organizational survival that I would make. I hope that.
All right. Well, let's just let Sebastian maybe have a moment to respond. Sebastian.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just very quickly, great answer. Thank you very much, Tim. I just wanted to note that I'm very much looking forward how you riff that off towards the aspect of flourishing. So not the doomsday, but the integrative approach as being something that is planet and human centric for well-being. So I just wanted to note that, my curiosity. So thank you again for your wonderful answer. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Sebastian. Yeah, and thank you also for that prompt, because maybe that's something. It's always a question from which perspective do you frame the content that you present. I think it's already very much in here, right? This is essentially a very empowering and hopefully flourishing way of looking at an organization, where, I mean, hey, we're understanding that we're part of one interconnected whole. That's the worldview. It's a very organismic, if you want, worldview that then translates into organizations. So the integrative perspective here is essentially saying we depend on these systems. We co-evolve with these systems, and so let's collaborate and let's nourish these systems instead of ignoring them and thereby destroying them. The collective aspect says, well, the goal isn't to make as much money as possible in the short term and then and ignore everything else, but it's really how can we bring everyone into this operation, and how can we respect and acknowledge their needs and their perspectives in the best possible way. So this really becomes an undertaking for the community and not just for itself. And I mean, the adaptive dimension is maybe a little bit more technical in that sense, but it becomes very, in that sense, very responsive to its environment that it's intimately connected with. So I view this very much as a flourishing perspective of businesses. Maybe I just emphasized that the other aspect a bit more. But I'm sure also later, as we talk more about the organizational transformation that needs to occur, that I think we can dive into that also a bit more.
Tim, I'm going to slip in a question, and if you can address it briefly, it's in the chat. Is systemic management specifically like for organizations, or do you ever use systemic management as we're looking at it here when dealing with systems that transcend one organization, like multiple services, networks, groups, actors, countries? It's a question from Victor, if you don't mind.
Absolutely, yeah. So my personal view would be, we framed it around organizations here, but these characteristics of living systems and these ways of being as part of these systems, to me, apply on every level of the system, even individually. So I personally, I view myself in an integrative way, and hopefully act in a collective way, and I try to be adaptive. So that's on the individual level. On the organizational level, as presented, that applies as well. Same for networks, systems of organizations. So absolutely. So it's framed a certain way here, but I would definitely apply these principles on any system level.
Could I add one small point, Lynn and Tim?
Sure.
I just wanted to offer, I think one of the reasons why the management and organizational piece is relevant is a lot of our organization is that systems thinking and how it's applied in practice is quite prevalent. It exists in broader conversations and in circles of organizations and networks trying to solve problems in more sophisticated ways. And one of the challenges we experience is that organizations run into a disconnect between how they might orient themselves in big and broad conversations that apply systems thinking, and then how that jives or ends up conflicting with the way that practices are executed within the context of an organization. So what we've envisioned, or at least experienced and seen, is that there is a limitation to a leader's ability to make sense of systemic practices inside of the context of an organization with its own set of ways of thinking and operating and relating, the way departments are set up, et cetera. So it's necessary to do the translation as part of overcoming the complexity, to provide management-focused innovations that help leaders to envisage, to design practices in accordance with systems thinking. It's not the kind of thing that somebody just figures out off the side of their desk because they appreciate systems thinking. You know, configuring how we do management accounting or business modeling or strategic planning is a highly complex task that really smart people have spent many years, and in some cases more than a decade, working on to produce the kinds of innovations that we're interested in bringing forward. I hope that's helpful as another point of reflection. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. That's great. I just learned that we only have about 2 minutes left for this part of our presentation. So if we could just quickly switch to the next slide, and I'll try to just get through the remaining content pretty quickly. This is our working definition of what then distinguishes a systemic management innovation. So much of this we've talked about already. It applies systems theory to recast how strategic management is understood. It provides meaningful guidance for leaders into how to effectively adapt management practices. So it's not just a graphic, a visual, and then doesn't tell you how to really change management practices. So there's guidance. It aligns with science and ethics-based thresholds. Much more on that later with the context-based sustainability session. And it enables more integrative, collective, and adaptive practices like we've just learned. Let's go to the next slide, please, Randy. And I'll try to make this super quick. I just brought one quick example. If you could go back to the one before, please. I think we went 2 slides. So I thought for a design conference, I think a business model design, hopefully this is an audience where some or many of you have seen the Flourishing Business, the business model canvas, at least already. So Osterwalder's business model canvas. Just one quick example, and I'll make it quick, for how systemic management innovation would be distinguished from a normal management innovation. So the business model canvas, super successful, widely used, asks 9 key questions for how to design your business. You know, what are we doing? How are we doing it? For whom? And what's the value we're creating? Somewhat systemic in that it takes some stakeholders into account, but there are a lot of shortcomings. Focuses only on economic success, focuses only on business partners and customers as relevant stakeholders. And there's, for example, no recognition of the co-destruction of value that's possible through the activities of the business. Now, compared to that, a canvas on the next slide, Randy, please, that our co-founder, Anthony Upward, who's I think maybe also in this room, has developed. Perhaps many of you have seen it before, the Flourishing Business Canvas. You can immediately see it looks very similar to the normal business model canvas. It asks more questions, and that's because it introduces the nested systems of society and the environment beyond just the economical aspects. It therefore considers goals of the organization that are beyond just financial goals. It considers all relevant stakeholders. It considers value destructions. And I won't go into how, but it therefore is more integrative, collective, and adaptive than the normal business model canvas. And I'll close with that. I hope I didn't go too far over time. Thanks so much. And I think I'll give back to Randy, if I'm not wrong.
Tim, is there anything that you wanted to show? You've got a little bit more time from Randy, so don't rush. I mean, we don't have to be too linear. If there's some final slides you want to show, please, if you can, let's tuck those in. Yes or no?
That's great. Thanks, Lynn. I thought I was already over time. No, so slide-wise, this is all that I have for today. I rushed the last few slides a little bit, so maybe if there's a question, like I'd love to take another question if there's anything that people are curious about. But slide-wise, that's it from my side.
Right. Well, there's this little opening if anybody wants to ask a question. Tim, that was fantastic and just so tight and helpful for everybody. Anybody have a
Thank you, Lynn.
rising question?
Sebastian.
I have a very quick one.
Oh, here we go.
How does this relate to Richie Dunham's work? I believe I already asked Randy this at one point because we did meet in one workshop before.
Sorry, could you elaborate, please?
James Richie Dunham from Harvard, who proposes the Flourishing Enterprise. Does that resonate? Does that sound familiar? Otherwise, I'll just share a link. It's okay. Absolutely.
Please do. Yeah, no, but I'd love to still answer your question. So maybe if you could elaborate a little bit and give me something to work with, then we can do that.
No, I was just wondering, how does it relate? Do you guys collaborate? How does it all sit? And you know, they've been doing, like, since the early 2000s. They've I think the first research, you know, is almost 2 decades old. So I was just wondering, when did you kick in? How does it? Do you guys collaborate? Yeah.
Tim, may
Anthony, is that you?
I think I know what Sebastian's referring to. You're referring to the Human Flourishing Project at Harvard, correct?
Exactly. Yes. So exactly.
Yes. Okay.
Ah,
So
okay.
so this is a project that has been certainly in its inception entirely independent of us. And one of the things that's interesting about it is that it's focusing on a different scale of flourishing than we are, generally speaking. We're focusing at the organizational scale. They're very much focusing at the individual scale. So obviously individuals make up organizations, and there's a need for organizations to consider how to enable flourishing at the individual level. So there's a conceptual connection there, which I think is what you're pointing to. We have started collaborating with an organization called the Future of Flourishing, who have direct ties to that work at Harvard. And a couple of us are currently exploring the intersection between organizational flourishing design principles and individual flourishing design principles as a way to start to move that intersection forward. Early days, very early days, but there is some work going on in that space. I have not yet had a chance to speak to the folks at Harvard, but I'm hoping I have that opportunity in not too distant future.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and thank you, Sebastian, for your question. And please put any link in the chat for folks to learn more. So appreciate that. Tim,
That helps, Sebastian.
It did. It's just really interesting that they're
on mute.
towards the enterprise.
You're on mute, Sebastian.
No, I think
we can hear him.
We can hear him.
It's just very interesting that they're moving towards the enterprise, all I know, and you're more moving towards the individual. You have all of this movement from the SDGs to the inner development goals. So I think there's something really interesting. I'm very happy to hear that there's the future of flourishing as well, and you know, maybe something that creates a greater echo is emerging from all of that. So it's really great to learn. Thank you very much.
I would just make a note of caution about the inner development goals. They are, as are the SDGs, problematic in quite a few different ways. But directionally, I completely agree with you.
It's just really, I absolutely acknowledge that, and I second what you're saying, Anthony. Absolutely, it's just the general pattern. That's all I'm saying. For the good, for the bad.
All right.
Lots of discussion around it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for your interest. I hope you'll consider, getting involved with the Institute, given your interest. And so I am going to turn it back to you, Tim, who then passes it on to Bernd. Is that right? So I'll let you just do that yourself, and I'll just adjust the spotlights here.
Thanks so much, Lynn. Yeah, so just a thanks from my side. And again, if there are any questions that haven't been answered, feel free to contact me or us at any time. But without further ado, I'm curious to hear from Bernd as well as you are. So Bernd, why don't you take it away?
Thank you very much, Tim. So thanks to Tim, we now learned a lot about transitioning to systemic innovations. That's important. Now the next path is turning this around and helping organizations to flourish, because that's what the mission is of the FEI, and that's what we like to incubate. So if we please go to the next slide to have a look at the next, exactly, thank you. Let's have a look here and let's study the diagram to the right side. Is that not what we just heard from Professor John Ehrenfeld and Peter Jones? That within that iceberg model, there is this mindset of leaders which we should address first. And that seems very relevant because that is the highest leverage point we can actually address. And if we manage that, then from there, our theory could unfold much easier and much better, because then from there we could address the need to introduce these innovations, the systemic management ones, as they would become part of the overall strategic management practices. So that is our theory of change. We want to address that need, and we want to incubate these ideas in our enterprise evolution program. Looking to the left of the slide, I think we covered that we do see the organizations as drivers of the poly crisis in all sorts of ways, but we do acknowledge that if organizations would really embrace their mandate, and many people have given that names like license to operate, etc., they could therefore have a huge impact on the future flourishing of the planet, of the people in our organizations. We understand that currently most organizations, they don't see that bigger picture, and they don't understand complexity on that level, and that would be a very necessary move of the paradigm in their thinking and in their management, leave alone the business schools, as we just heard again. So if organizations could understand that interconnectedness of the challenges, they could also become more proactive and more adaptive for themselves. And these systemic management innovations, when integrated and practiced, they can be tailored to implement solutions across the necessary contexts. And suffices to say, organizations as living systems have to become more adaptive, transformative, ultimately future ready, because their purpose and their culture and their practice, they can actually evolve. That is not set in stone. And that takes us to the next slide, with which I'm very proud introducing the Enterprise Evolution as a capability development program that is incubated in the FEI, designed to enable organizations to transition from conventional to systemic strategic management practices. That's our mission. Next slide, please. Wow. So what is the scope of our Enterprise Evolution program? We like to focus on the window of strategic management that you can see here to the right. These are the fundamental basic elements of strategic management, and we would like to address these accordingly. We apply it at the center of the organization at the strategic management level, as we can identify it today. We would then go and enable transformation in an integrated way across these levels and layers, starting with adapting the strategic function, by developing systemic planning and performance management. We then leverage the relevancy of building cooperative relationships for all stakeholders that are impacted or that are required to achieve the necessary goals. And lastly, we have to develop new and necessary capabilities and competences to evolve that organizational culture. How do we do that? On the next slide. In big letters, we write here what we do need, and I think this speaks directly to what John Ehrenfeld called the right side of the brain, the caring, the empathy. How do we go about this? How do we really take care as a capability program? Well, we call it collaborative design. We need to leverage a highly co-productive, co-creative relationship here. We need to work hand in hand with the employees and co-design and customize the program to that organization's unique needs, their priorities, their ambitions. They're all different. They're living systems, right? So they have evolved. They are somewhere with their identity. We need to pick them up right there where they sit in their story now. And with that vision that they have and how they would love to evolve to become something more powerful, relating to the right side of the brain and less to the left side. There's a flexible approach to the program and its design. And we need to be responsive to that emergence that might unfold. Program, hence, has to be co-facilitated, and the employees have to be empowered to lead with us. And ideally, they should stand actually in front of our consultants. And we need to have this co-creative approach with them and with us, ourselves included. Next slide, please. We go one level deeper with explaining our focus for this capability development program. And I think it's understood that we need to employ a very facilitative and dialogic approach to trigger that right brain side and take care of people that are going through our program as we learn and we practice these systemically designed new practices. It's about practice and less about theory. So staff needs to learn through experience and build these competencies and capability which are necessary. We need to focus overall, enabling all these individuals as their system and subsystems to grow as necessary to achieve that transformative change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So where are we right now? What are we doing and what's our ambition here to support that quite brave mission, I must say? Our goal is to develop a model for scaling the facilitation of the program on a global level. We are very well aware that we need to balance the accessibility so it's facilitated effectively and with integrity. It needs a different approach than the typical big consultancy approach take. Today, we are talking of a supportive team of around 30 plus partners that we have assembled over the last couple of months. It's all experts, consultants, and a broad base of academics that are supporting us in the thinking and in the practice of putting this ambitious program together. And here goes an invitation that Randy is going to frame later on in a broader way, because we are still collaborating and we will require more collaborators to further develop our program, as we will also go logically and have to test it in the field with our customers out there. And that practice and learning of experience, well, it will inform our scaling model that we also have to design as we go. I believe this is the last slide. And if that is the case, and I haven't checked in the chat, I give it over and back to Randy, and then we take questions after section 5.
Thanks, Bernd.
Wonderful. Sorry, I'm not sure what just happened to the screen share. I think we're still okay. Anyway, Bernd, thank you so much for talking us through this idea of facilitating the transformational change that's needed to get organizations from conventional practice towards systemic management practices, and introducing the enterprise evolution concept. Definitely will share that appeal or opportunity for others to get involved later on in the session. For now, I want to move on to a quick case study that I'll run us through. It's not a lot of time to really get into the details, but the exciting news is we've had the opportunity to apply this enterprise evolution program. This is through my own consulting practice, which is adjacent to my work with the FEI. So I lead an organization called Refocus that does direct delivery of services and facilitation with senior leadership teams, and had the opportunity over the course of about 2.5, 3 years to work with the senior leadership team and other leaders from across the organization at the City of Kitchener to facilitate an enterprise evolution program. I'm going to share just a little bit of information on that over the next few minutes to give you a sense as to how this unfolded in real time. So I guess it was back in 2020, the City of Kitchener began the process of developing their next strategic plan and 20-year vision. So the strategic plan was for 2023 to 2026, but they gave themselves a 2-year window across which to develop that strategic plan with various stakeholders. So, in terms of mindsets, going back to the concept that both Tim and Bernd shared about needing to transition or shift mindsets of leaders in order to, deal with the deeper parts of the iceberg and enable the possibility of deeper change. We originally started with a head of sustainability who introduced us to a head of strategy that was responsible for the strategic plan. And when she understood our approach and got really excited about it, the first thing she said was, well, we can't do any of this unless our entire senior leadership team is on board, because this isn't just a strategic plan. This is like really calling into question and looking to disrupt, transform, enable change to the strategic management practices that govern the organization. And so in the middle of the first wave of the pandemic, no less, we engaged the senior leadership team in 3 half-day workshops. They felt it was worth making the time while they were all in emergency response mode and working crazy hours, because they felt the disruption and recognized that they need to be ready in the future for stuff like this. And we went through these 3 workshops, and perhaps, if I'm going to share one quick nugget, is just the nut that we cracked that I think is maybe absent in this field of systemic innovation, sustainability, et cetera, in how it appeals to senior leaders. Of course, there is a moral ethical imperative, and we're well aware senior leaders in organizations, especially larger ones, also have the necessity of doing their job and maintaining the viability of the organization. And those 2 things are seen as very much in conflict. And I think what really changed for us in this conversation is we didn't really talk about sustainability very much at all. We talked about accelerating change and increasing complexity, which is what they're confronted by and struggling to manage in their day-to-day jobs. And when we could present systemic perspectives as a means for resolving or making sense of why their job has become so much harder, and to indicate that it's only going to get much harder, it opened up a space. And when we created an opportunity for them to be vulnerable and to talk openly about what they're experiencing and the struggles they have, they were really able to step into that space and able to share with their colleagues in ways that they don't typically. My sense is most leaders are struggling to some degree in silence because the context is changing so quickly. And so in the context of that struggle and the openness that was shared and the vulnerability, we were able to introduce a few systemic innovations that they were able to experiment with in a safe way in a very short period of time at a superficial level. And just seeing that there are these other innovations that have been designed in a manner that's adequately sophisticated for the complexity that they're struggling to manage gave them a sense that, they would almost be silly to not begin the process of experimenting and seeing what these things could do in practice. And on the basis of us having no experience in the municipal sector, not being tried, tested, or true, which is generally the beacons for successful procurement in the municipal sector, we were able to secure their willingness to go ahead with us leading this process. And really the design of this engagement was to, use systemic innovations to support them developing a more effective strategic plan and 20-year vision, but to the end of learning and developing new capabilities such that some of these practices could be extended beyond the scope of our engagement to support the organization going forward in general. And that's what really excited us. So there was a wide range of different practices, tools, methods, frameworks that we used that were systemic in nature. And I think what was important from the perspective of us as facilitators was that it wasn't so much about the innovations. It was about connecting with the practices that they employ, the people that are around the table, their motivations, their ambitions, what they're closed to, and designing in a fluid, flexible, and authentic way new ways of doing things that made sense to them. And sometimes that meant compromising what would be ideal. And in other cases, we were able to challenge them more so. But to get into a little bit of the substance of it, let me share some of the results. So if we think about how they would have historically developed a strategic plan at the city. In terms of their vision and future orientation, usually they would create like a simple statement based on 3 adjectives that describe the future of their city. And that would essentially be it. And they would spend however many hours deliberating over what those 3 adjectives would be. And it might sound silly, but like this is common practice, common best practice in the municipal sector. Often vision statements look like that. In terms of participation, generally speaking, something at this level would be mainly driven, and in the case of City Kitchener, it was mainly driven by senior leadership with some inputs collected from others, including leaders from across the organization and members of the public. But it's more like inputs that they consider in developing the strategic plan. In terms of the output or the deliverable, typically what would happen, and which was very much the case at the City of Kitchener, is that a static plan would be etched out in stone with a set of actions to be executed over the next 4 years. And that would serve as an accountability structure for the organization to deliver on its strategic plan. From the perspective of integration, it essentially would be a high-level plan in the organization that isn't really considerate or meaningfully integrated with the dozen or so other high-level plans that exist in municipal organizations. So you have community plans and sustainability plans and equity plans, and these things would not have one sort of simple way of integrating or a resolution between them. And finally, in terms of accountability, there would be a periodic assessment of progress on the execution of the actions. So there wouldn't be any meaningful way of measuring actual impact or the degree to which the strategy is serving the organization in fulfilling on its purpose or its vision. And this might all sound pretty crazy, but this is very much standard practice in the municipal sector. And so, introducing systemic ways of approaching the problem set, the challenge, and the objectives that they're trying to achieve, a whole bunch of stuff changed. And this is just to give you some indication of how all of the characteristics that Bernd described of the Enterprise Evolution Program and how we're orienting ourselves to try and affect change in a more meaningful way resulted in some interesting results. So first of all, from the perspective of vision and future, the city ended up developing a story defined by community level goals that accompanied its vision. So they did have a statement, but they recognized that it wasn't authentic as a standalone statement. There needed to be more meaning making and clarity around it to really be substantive. And it was ultimately informed by strategic foresight practices, which gave them a better sense as to what the future possibilities could be and a meaningful connection to futures across multiple time horizons. In terms of participation, the process ended up being highly iterative. And so there was a working group from across the organization that was given much more responsibility for actually leading the development. And the public was brought into the process through a reference panel. So typically, the city would get to a certain point in engaging the public, and then everything would go internal. All the inputs would be taken and applied, and most of those inputs are relatively superficial. In this case, a group of about 40 residents were involved in a 6-month-long process where they worked directly with the dedicated planners who are focused on the strategic plan to understand all of the work that they had done to design the plan, all the considerations they had made, and the complexity involved in leading an entire city, and then to provide feedback and opportunities that they saw for improving or adapting the plan to be even more effective. And that ended up being an extremely fruitful relationship that has not previously existed in that way. In terms of the output, so they shifted from this static 4-year plan to essentially seeing strategic planning as a living, breathing process of sense making, rather than creating this output of 4 years of actions, which 1 year or 18 months after they're cast no longer makes sense because things have changed so dramatically. And so the commitment they now have is to work from this initial set of strategic priorities to ongoingly monitor essentially what's happening in the community, how needs and opportunities are evolving, and to adapt or adjust the strategic priorities of the city in response to them, so that then those priorities can be taken as a meta-level set of priorities that connect the city and its purpose to its vision. They can be used as they're adapted to inform and influence all of the other lower level planning processes within the organization, including their annualized business planning and budgeting process, which is how things get done. In terms of integration, essentially, the idea is that, again, the priorities are connected directly to the vision, and the vision is about the well-being of the community. So now the city has a means for making sense of what is most in jeopardy or most in need in terms of the well-being of the community, and ensuring that's reflected in their plans based on the levers they hold and what they can do to make a difference. And finally, in terms of accountability, their commitment, it hasn't yet come into practice, but their commitment was to essentially keep this cross-organizational team structure that they used to develop the plan by continuing to convene cross-organizational teams dedicated to each community level goal that they hold as a way of making sense of things and staying connected with various stakeholders in the process of figuring out how things should evolve. A couple of quick learnings. I'm just conscious of the time here. So one, I want to mention, we're trying to enable a long transition here, and I think part of what made this process successful was just recognizing that we can't get from A to B in one iteration. We aim to stretch leaders to have them see things differently, and that has to happen in an ambitious but patient and compassionate way that allows people to experience the benefit of making changes and then to become more understanding and more ambitious as a result of those experiences. And from that perspective, the skill in facilitation lies in really getting, not just listening, but experiencing through building relationships with the people around the table where they're starting and what their motivations are, what their ambitions are, and not stretching them too far too soon. Another really critical piece is that we learned was that transforming one aspect of management in isolation or two aspects of management in isolation without beginning to address the others will harshly constrain the potential results. So for example, if we plan in a systemic manner, but then our method of managing performance is not systemic, our ability to make sense and then have the right inputs into our strategic planning the next time will not be there. And so our strategic planning will suffer. So we really need to think about this as a cross-organizational transformation. It's not like everything has to happen at exactly the same time, but there needs to be an eye to the idea of transitioning practices across the board. And ultimately, this transition or transformation isn't predictable. So it's just so important for us to remain humble and flexible, to continue tailoring and approaching our facilitation with a very light touch and to be listening to those who are collaborating within the organization to figure out how to proceed. So yeah, just a few questions that I wanted to throw out. This is with reference to both Bernd and my presentation, and Tim's as well for that matter. I'm curious if you have any questions about the Enterprise Evolution Program, anything about the City of Kitchener example. If you might have some challenges you'd present to us about the difficulties in making this applicable or even appetizing for organizational leaders. Maybe you have an idea of an opportunity related, anything else.
Thank you, Randy.
Cheers.
Yeah, thank you very much. I love these questions, and I'm wondering, I'm going to invite anyone who wants to put their hands up and voice their question, but I wonder if everybody in chat, if you have the ability just to put, and this is the end of the presentation around this flourishing enterprise approach, and you heard from Tim and you heard from Bernd and you've heard from Randy. What one comment would you make about it? Like, what would be either a question or a comment, or what has really struck you about it? I think we all learn by sharing with each other what we want to, what struck us or what really stood out or what our takeaway is. And when you do that, we all underline the learning. So I'd invite you to put into chat the one thing that's really struck you this morning about this approach. So while you're doing that, I also will encourage anyone who would like to voice a question. And I'm hoping that you'll take that occasion to write something. Thank you for doing that. While everyone's doing that, and I hope we see more, thank you very much, Sebastian and Anthony and others. This term conventional, the conventional management, I've been thinking about that term conventional, and then there's evolved. In your experience, Randy, if you use the term evolved, what's been the real reaction to that, or do you kind of keep that in the back pocket? I'm thinking about the word itself and whether it actually lights people up or it just how they react to the word if you actually use it in your sessions?
Yeah, it's a fair question, and I don't know that I have a good answer. I mean, I feel like our experience so far, market wide is somewhat limited, so it's hard for me to say definitively, um, what the average response is or what's the most common response. I think in terms of our space, those who are, interested in systemic approaches and the future of organizations, the idea of an evolutionary enterprise makes a heck of a lot of sense. We understand like kind of when we evolve quickly and efficiently, we're essentially the best able to survive or continue to live and potentially flourish. I think evolution is perhaps a little more approachable than some words for management leaders. I could be completely wrong about that. I haven't done a deep market study and I feel odd making broad assessments based on my limited experience, but it's certainly something for us to pay attention to. So I appreciate the prompt. I mean, Anthony also put a question or a prompt in the chat about the future. And if we don't have questions at the moment, I'm happy to just run through our last few slides. And if there is a question that comes up sooner, by all means, just interrupt me and we can prioritize that first. Is that okay?
Yeah, that sounds great. And thank you very much for these comments in the chat. They're rich and much appreciated. Over to you, Randy.
Cheers. Thank you. So yes, a little bit about our future, and thanks for the prompt, Anthony. So what's essentially happened for us at the FEI is, we started out kind of thinking about the idea of bringing applied research to some of the testing of the innovations that we've seen circling around in our network over the past years, and wanted to continue to build the community practice that has been really at the center of our existence since we started back in 2012, as we originally mentioned. And what organically unfolded was, there was a gravitation of partners towards specific innovations or innovation processes or topics. And it just sort of naturally happened that we started to develop these partnership-based projects. And after sort of a year of replanning and adjusting our approach to engagement, this just sort of organically emerged and has become what I would describe as the future direction of the FEI. So these project-based work streams that I'm about to introduce you to are not fixed. They're not set. They will evolve based on how opportunities and partners evolve in their own collaboration. But here we go. So in terms of those work streams, one is dedicated to systemic management innovation. So as Tim described, we see this as an emerging field. We're in the process of publishing literature on the topic, trying to essentially bring a name, a term, to this emergent field of unique management innovation that we feel is very important, necessary, and relevant, and to bring others along in that journey, especially those who are developing systemic management innovations and trying to disrupt some facet or aspect of management on their own. We believe that there's a lot more strength in putting this community or network of innovations together as part of a whole, so that leaders, as they come to terms with or see the opportunity in systemic management, see a whole field of relevant and complementary innovations that they can use together. Second is the Enterprise Evolution Program, which we just did a bit of a dive on. Thanks to Bernd for that and some of the details that I shared around City of Kitchener. We have a whole project, as Bernd mentioned, that we've now developed, which is around bringing partners together that are interested in further developing the program, designing a model for scaling it, and testing it out in the field so that we can learn in practice and use that as a means for maximizing the impact of this program. And as is the case with most systemic management innovations, there is a very purposeful leader or leaders behind them who are interested in impact over intellectual property or profits. So in the same way, this Enterprise Evolution Program is being designed to maximize its potential impact in the field, not to be possessed or contained to a small group. And then we have municipalities adapting in response to complexity. So this is an initiative we started specifically in the municipal sector, where there's a lot of room and potentially recognized need for systemic approaches. And so we're testing systemic innovations, including the Enterprise Evolution, with municipalities. And in particular, there's already very strong networks and groups in that sector that are working on those sorts of innovations. And so we're trying to bring together academics, NGOs who program in this space, municipalities, and the innovators to accelerate our opportunities for testing these innovations and learning from them so that we can scale them. Next is the low carbon resilience approach. So this is something that we developed in partnership with the Action on Climate team at Simon Fraser University. They developed essentially what I would describe as a systemic approach to addressing climate change in the municipal sector in particular. Essentially, that approach organically and naturally leads organizations to recognize the shortcomings of conventional approaches to dealing with climate change in the ways that, you know, Tim's slide on the conventional ways of dealing with challenges would suggest, and sort of compartmentalized, you know, on the side of the organization types approaches. And it leads to different conversations. And the experiences, like when those conversations are well facilitated, leaders engage. They see the relevance of these systemic issues and the necessity to act differently. And when they see that applied to a challenge, a complex systemic issue like climate change, they start to recognize that this is a better way of dealing with all issues and all of the objectives of the organization, and adapting practices across the board. So we're refining and improving the low carbon resilience approach, which was tested with 10 municipalities, and looking to, again, scale the testing of it so that we can learn and scale the approach. And the last is around context-based sustainability. So this is a management accounting method that was developed to support organizations navigating towards the science and ethics-based thresholds that define sustainability. So in a simple example, you know, we can reduce the amount of water an organization does, or we can be conscious of the biological or ecological limits of the watershed that an organization is dependent on, understanding the needs of all other stakeholders who rely on that watershed, and what a fair, just, and equitable proportion of that watershed would be for one organization, as a means for then determining whether or not what they're doing is sustainable, and how unsustainable the needs and uses of everyone else happen to be. So context-based sustainability is about bringing management accounting rigor and integration to how we address sustainability performance. You know, from our perspective, and without going into too much detail, given that our next session is specifically a workshop on context-based sustainability, we see most measurement reporting in the sustainability space as, one, relatively superficial, and two, mostly absent of consideration of sustainability itself, which is, you know, depends on us understanding some kind of limit or threshold and knowing whether or not we're achieving it and how far away from it we happen to be, so that we can be rational and thoughtful about, you know, the degree to which we recognize change is needed and how much to prioritize that, etc. In any case, with all of these project-based work streams, we have open networks. So whether you're just interested in learning, if you want to contribute to applying these innovations in the field with your clients or in your own organization, if you're an academic and you want to collaborate on research, there is essentially an unlimited number of opportunities to jump in and engage with us. So we really extend an open hand and arms if you happen to want to get to know any of these initiatives a little more deeply, and if you happen to want to jump in on one of our meetings and get involved. I did not go through the details, but we'll hopefully be able to share the slides later. I'll finish with the word, you know, like even beyond the project-based work streams, we encourage you to stay engaged with us. You can connect with us separately on the FEI website. Super simple to sign up for our monthly newsletters and to get information on our monthly cafes. Those are our networking meetings. And, you know, if this sounds like an organization that you want to be a part of course, we're always growing our team and looking for exceptional leaders like those who you've heard from today, who are interested in being part of the movement that we're creating. And on that note, I'll say a big thank you and pass back to Lynn.
Thank you very much, Randy, Bernd, and Tim. There was so much that's applicable to those of us who work with organizations, and just seeing in a new way and moving things forward, and some fabulous comments around how it's you know, inspiring and broadening of the conversation. So thank you very, very much. And a shout out to Morgan she's been putting those resources in. So appreciate it. So thank you very much. There's a short break, and then at the bottom of the hour, we're switching to another room and going into context-based sustainability. So just perfect segue there, Randy. It's just where you left off is really where we want to start giving you a very practical way of, you know, starting to put some real surroundings around sustainability and what's going on there. And Bill Bowie will be joining us. So take a break, and back at 1:30, you'll go back to the lobby and then come into the new room if you're joining us. And if not, thank you so much for everything today, participants, and we'll see you soon.
If anybody does have a last question, I'm happy to stick around for 5 minutes and hear from anyone else that wants to jump in. And thank you so much, Lynn, for facilitating so wonderfully and keeping us on track. You did a great job, and yeah, really appreciate it so very much.
Right.
Thanks so much, Lynn.
See you soon.
Thanks, Morgan.
Bye-bye.
Randy,
Thanks, Morgan.
Pick up your offer.
Please, of course.
A resonance, basically a hope, because we already mentioned the human flourishing. We've had since the 60s, 70s, we have people like E.F. Schumacher with the middle way, and companies such as Scott Bader, and so I'd be really, you know, I would hope that, you know, one could dig out more companies like Scott Bader. I don't know how familiar you are with them and the principles applied according to Fred Schumacher's thinking. So that there's all these stories of active hope, as Morgan so beautifully put in the chat, of substantive optimism rather than declarations of, right?
Yeah, thanks so much, Sebastian. I would invite any of my colleagues to share if they have something specific that might be useful to get across. I mean, I'm a non-academic, to be very frank about it, and certainly like the long history of relevant contributors, and both theoretically and practically speaking, is not so much my expertise. I think I mean, I get that there is a very progressive lineage to all of the work, and we definitely see the stuff that we're doing right now as sitting on the shoulder of giants like John Ehrenfeld, who made massive contributions. This idea of systemic management is not a new one, but what we have felt is that the practical innovation that helps a leader go from rationally getting the idea behind a systemic approach and being able to consistently and reliably apply that, or figure out how to apply that in the context of their own existing organization, including all of the constraints and challenges that exist that don't align with that, is where the complexity lies, and why systemic management and practices have fallen down or failed to produce the results that they can. You know, if we all fundamentally believe that a systemic approach is going to better reflect reality and just give a leader and an organization a better opportunity to operate rationally in line with its goals, there should be nothing that stands in the way, except for the existing paradigm of management. And so it's really this translation that we see as being the substance and what's been missing in this field of systemic management innovations that we see. So while we're deeply interested in and pay endless respect to the wide history and wide spectrum of what there is around the concepts of flourishing and systems theory, we do have this relatively refined and focused center of our work, which is on these innovations that make it possible for that systemic way of thinking and practicing to become real and effective in an organizational context that isn't already calling for it. I'm curious, maybe Anthony, if you have anything to add, Bernd, Tim, Peter, of course. I just noticed you're there as well.
Yeah. Well, I'd say this is picking up on John Ehrenfeld's pragmatic approach. I mean, between systemic management innovations as a category and as a dedication for the FEI to be able to be it's kind of like a clearinghouse, but not really. I mean, we're not a center where all of these can be kind of provided by different consultants, but we do have a number of consultants and academics who are interested in the different tools. And we also have, you know, as an institute, a good standing and the ability to create, you know, the relationships with the innovators themselves. So it's kind of like a new business model for representing the potential impact for these innovators that on their own may not be able to scale that well. And I don't want to pick on kind of any particular examples, but just, you know, when you have academics or even people who've developed certain tools very deeply for a long time, and they're also, you know, they're looking for organizations that are really going to pay attention and work with them in a correct way, it helps to have different perspectives to connect those innovators and those tools with different types of organizations. And a small group can't serve everybody, and we're not a one-size-fits-all approach either. We're not trying to, and we're trying to maintain the innovations in all their integrity and to kind of sustain them through the Institute in a way that can provide access to them. And these may include some that are very well known and used fairly widely, like the Systemic Design Toolkit has been developed, you know, for a number of years now and has good support, and that is, I consider, one of them. But some of the sustainability innovations are, you know, do require some real rigor within the organization. We think they answer questions that, you know, we found that they answer the questions that you know, that enterprises will have about the, you know, how to implement things like, you know, the donut economics model, for example. How do you actually make that work, measure it, implement it, define the factors for it? And so the enterprise evolution process is also a way to develop a cadre of people that can learn from each other in a type of, you know, learning organization, network consultancy, if you will, that can learn these and implement and take them into different contexts as well. So a new type of business model may be evolving with this, but we hope that, you know, we can be a good representatives for what we think are the, you know, the best tools and innovations that can be used to inspire organizations to move in the right direction.
Thanks so much, Peter. I think Randy and Lynn had to move over to the next session, which we also want to encourage everyone to participate in. A very exciting session on context-based sustainability with Bill Bowie. I think if there are no other urgent points or questions at this point, then we'll close this session for today. We want to thank all of you for being here and for the great engagement. And again, a big invitation for any of you that have any further points to discuss, ideas, want to get in touch, want to somehow participate, to reach out to us and to just get in touch. And so this could only be the beginning, and doesn't have to be the end. It's just the end of this session. So please head over to the context-based sustainability session if you like. Otherwise, we'll say thank you and have a great day.